My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
And that's how Jimmy Carter began his speech accepting the presidential nomination, July 15th, 1976, at the Democratic National Convention in New York City. And it's the last clip we'll play of Jimmy Carter talking about himself, because this episode of C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly, is all about what President Carter said about other presidents. We'll start with President Carter talking about Richard Nixon, whose scandal-scarred presidency paved the way for Jimmy Carter's 1976 victory. Here's President Carter talking about President Nixon at the dedication of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, November 4th, 1991.
Environmental issues are with us. I was a president who was very proud of the fact that under Richard M. Nixon, we saw the Congress and him work together to achieve the Environmental Protection Agency, pure air and water legislation, the Council of Environmental Quality.
Next, the president who Jimmy Carter defeated in 1976, Gerald Ford. First, here's how President Carter began his January 20th, 1977 inauguration speech.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land.
Now, here's President Carter giving the eulogy at President Ford's funeral, almost exactly 30 years later, January 3rd, 2007, in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land. Those were the first words I spoke as president. And I still hate to admit that they received more applause than any other words in my inaugural address.
Now, the man who defeated Jimmy Carter when he ran for re-election in 1980, Ronald Reagan. We return to President Carter speaking at the November 4th, 1991 dedication of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library.
Under President Ronald Reagan, our nation stood strong and resolute and made possible the beginning of the end of the Cold War. This has led to a new opportunity for our country to exhibit its greatness, which we accept for granted too often, more clearly to people around the world.
Ronald Reagan's successor as president was George H.W. Bush. President Carter opened with this line about President Bush when he spoke at the 1992 Democratic Convention.
I think I should tell you that I am enjoying my involuntary retirement, and I know and hope that President Bush will share the same pleasure after January.
Not the toughest partisan attack you'll ever hear. President Carter, in fact, had even kinder and gentler things to say about President Bush. Actually, both Presidents Bush, on August 20th, 2015. It was a news conference to discuss his cancer diagnosis.
Mr. President, Tom Jones from WSB-TV. You mentioned all the well-wishers. Has there been any one correspondence or call that really touched you?
Well, both of the former President Bush called me at one time, and then George H.W. Bush Sr. called me yesterday afternoon again. I think I appreciated that very much, and their wives were there on the telephone with them.
Now, President Bill Clinton. President Carter joined President Clinton at the White House on September 14th, 1993, to promote the North American Free Trade Agreement. Also attending the event to support NAFTA, President Gerald Ford and President George H.W. Bush. When it was his turn to talk, President Carter revealed a political secret.
I called Bill Clinton only 3 times during his administration, during his campaign. I was for him from the beginning. First time I've ever said this publicly, but I'm proud of it. Because I've tried to stay neutral, within the Democratic Party, but Rosa and I were for Bill. I called him 3 times. One of those times was when I feared that he might make a public statement denouncing the North American Free Trade Agreement. And he said, okay, I will be for it, but with provisos. We've got to do something about labor and protect the working people of our country, and we've got to do something about the environment. That has now been done. The side agreements have alleviated the serious questions that did arise about NAFTA.
Earlier, we heard President Carter address the Democratic Convention in 1992 in support of Bill Clinton for president. Here's what he told the Democratic Convention 20 years later, September 4th, 2012, about President Barack Obama.
Next month, God willing, I will enter the 88th year of my life. And 1 month later, Rosen and I will enter a voting booth in our hometown of Plains and cast another vote for Barack Obama and Joe Biden. We will do so with the confidence and conviction that they understand the challenges and difficult choices that face our nation and our people, in fact, all peoples of the world, in the years ahead. One thing I have learned over my lifetime as a submarine officer, as president, and as leader of the Carter Center is that the biggest challenges and problems that we face don't lend themselves to quick fixes, nor to the snappy rhetoric of a television commercial. Solutions are complex and difficult, requiring the judgment, skill, and patience to pursue the right policies for the right reasons.
We are now at President Donald Trump. On May 19, 2018, President Carter gave the commencement address at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, the year after Donald Trump did. In this clip, you'll hear President Carter mention both President Trump and Jerry. That's Jerry Falwell Jr., then the president of Liberty University.
This is a wonderful crowd. Jerry told me before we came here that it's even bigger, I hate to say this, than it was last year. I don't know if President Trump will admit that or not, but to me it speaks a lot.
Finally, President Joe Biden. President Jimmy Carter's last C-SPAN speaking appearance was another Democratic convention, August 18, 2020. When he spoke on behalf of Joe Biden, President Carter revealed this interesting nugget of political history.
When I ran for president in 1976, Joe Biden was my first and most effective supporter in the Senate. For decades, he has been my loyal and dedicated friend. Joe has the experience, character, and decency to bring us together and restore America's greatness.
You heard President Carter mention America's greatness, perhaps a reference to Donald Trump's Make America Great Again? If so, it leads to our bonus clip. Let's return to Jimmy Carter's 1976 presidential campaign and another mention of making America great. From November 1st, 1976, here's Jimmy Carter during a program that aired on the eve of the general election, taped at his home in Plains, Georgia.
I want to be sure that when I'm president, that within the White House, at my shoulder, will be a full-time counselor just speaking up for elderly people. So that every time I make a decision about housing, Social Security, taxation, welfare, health care, transportation, I never forget the fine, retired people of our country who've already given so much to make America great.
That's it for this episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly. A reminder, you can do your own searches in the C-SPAN video library. Just go to cspan.org and use the search bar on top. There are 216 Jimmy Carter videos in the C-SPAN video library. In fact, C-SPAN began during the Carter presidency in 1979. We'll end with the final words from President Jimmy Carter's farewell address to the nation, January 14th, 1981.
As I return home to the South, where I was born and raised, I look forward to the opportunity to reflect and further to assess, I hope with accuracy, the circumstances of our times. I intend to give our new president my support, and I intend to work as a citizen, as I've worked here in this office as president, for the values this nation was founded to secure. Again, from the bottom of my heart, I want to express to you the gratitude I feel. Thank you, fellow citizens, and farewell.